Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Alexa Chapivsky, Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. On behalf of the organization, I'd like to welcome you all to today's virtual discussion, Taking Stock, the State of Women, Peace, and Security, 22 years after Resolution 1325. Studies show that when more women are involved in peacekeeping, rates of misconduct are lower, credibility of forces is higher, and people have greater access to community needs. However, only 3% of peacekeepers are women. Moreover, women and girls are disproportionately affected by conflict. The unequal status of women and girls makes them especially vulnerable to sexual violence, economic distress, lack of justice, and more. Women's participation at all levels of peace and security ensures that women's issues are addressed in peacebuilding efforts, humanitarian aid, and negotiations. Our assembled group of experts this afternoon looks forward to discussing what's been accomplished and what challenges remain. I'd like to thank the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates to the US for partnering with us on this event and for being a committed supporter of the Women's Foreign Policy Group and the work that we do advancing women's voices and talent in global affairs. I would also like to recognize the WFPG board members and staff for their support in making this afternoon's discussion happen. We will have a Q&A at the close of the conversation. Please type your questions into the Q&A function as opposed to the raise hand function. Today's conversation will be led by Ambassador Milan Verveer, the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. It is my honor to introduce her. She has had an illustrious and distinguished career and has herself served as a valued mentor to so many women globally. Prior to her current position, Ambassador Verveer was the first US Ambassador for Global Women's Issues, a position to which she was nominated by President Obama in 2009. She worked to ensure that women's participation and rights are fully integrated into US foreign policy and played a leading role in the administration's development of the US National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. President Obama also appointed her to serve as the US representative to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Prior to that, she was the chair and co-CEO of Vital Voices Global Partnership, an international NGO that she co-founded to elevate and invest in emerging women leaders globally. During the Clinton administration, she served as assistant to the president and chief of staff to the First Lady. Ambassador Verveer, welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Alexa, for your introduction. I think the Women's Foreign Policy Group is fortunate indeed to have you as its new executive director. You bring a wealth of experience to this position, and I'm sure that you will flourish in it. So thank you for that. I also want to welcome each and every one of you who are joining us for this meeting today, for tuning in, and hopefully to participating in the Q&A portion. The Women, Peace, and Security Framework was established by the United Nations Security Council with its first resolution known by 1325, that number that's something we all can say in our sleep, I think. And it was strengthened with the adoption of 9 additional resolutions over the last 22 years. It recognizes the importance of women's involvement and the power of women's agency in peace and security, in conflict resolution, achieving sustainable peace, and in relief and recovery post-conflict. It also addresses the terrible reality of the disproportionate impact of war on women, particularly, and that through sexual violence that is too often now used as a weapon of war. So we have a very distinguished panel with us. I'm fortunate to have known and worked with all of them. They possess great expertise on this issue, and they will be addressing it from the different positions that they have held. I want to begin with Sahana Dharmapura, who is the inaugural director of Our Secure Future, which is the Women, Peace, and Security program of the One Earth Future Foundation. She's a gender expert and advisor to senior civilian policymakers and military officials on promoting peace and conflict resolution. Earlier, she served as an independent advisor on gender, peace, and security issues to the Departments of State and Defense, as well as USAID. Sahana, welcome. It's terrific that you can be with us. I want to see if you could just kick off this discussion today by briefly explaining why this Women, Peace, and Security framework is so essential for peace building and conflict resolution. And how is the United States implementing this framework? We had a national action plan that was developed some years ago, and that has now been superseded by the first law of its kind anywhere in the world, the United States law, the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017. So can you talk about it very generally and then really zero in on the United States and how we're doing?
Okay, well, thank you. Well, first, thank you, and thanks to my panelists, and thank you, WPG, for having this important conversation today. So I think, Alexa, and you also mentioned much of the research that's been done over the last 20 years that shows the significant impact that women can have and do have as agents of change in conflict zones and to state security in general, state security interests. There's a lot of other research that has shown that women's status in a country is a major predictor of the peacefulness or the violent nature of the country. And I think that all of that research taken together, we also know that in practice, really from civil society, women's civil society led the effort for meaningful participation in international security, peace, and decision-making, because let's face it, women have been largely left out of that environment. And it's women's civil society actors who said, hey, Permanent 5 UN Security Council resolution, we need to change the way that we think about security, the way we define it, and the way we do it. We really need to be much more effective to serve the interests of women, girls, men, boys, third gender, et cetera, in every place that we have these matters of peace and security. So I think that's sort of a nutshell of why it's important. Of course, there's much more nuance and much more that goes into that in many different fields. But I think the key thing is this is about women's agency, participation in decision-making, and the use of a gender perspective on understanding what are the challenges that face policymakers and all of us, and how to do a better job at solving those problems. So jumping to the US and the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017, so we know that countries, right now, 104 countries have national action plans that adopt actions and strategies to implement women, peace, and security. The United States is unique in that it has a law that mandates actually this legal commitment on the part of the US government, no matter who is in power, no matter which administration, whatever political party is in power, that the US actually is saying that it's the policy of the United States to promote the meaningful participation of women in all aspects of conflict prevention, management, and resolution, right? And also relief and recovery efforts. That is very significant because that law also identifies the 4 agencies that are responsible for having strategies of how to implement this. And that is the Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and USAID, the Agency for International Development. And it's important that we have this law. Why? Because it really provides continuity of action and commitment on women, peace, and security. And it also elevates women, peace, and security from being a sort of side, as we know, women's issues are often treated to be, sort of marginalized or side issues, not a priority. But having a law really puts women, peace, and security on par, equally so, with other important security priorities, because it is a legal commitment that needs to be embedded into our national security interests. So sort of that's a nutshell of why it's important. The Women, Peace, and Security Act, I should say, also very interestingly followed the trend of what happens in most other countries when women are active and organized together. It's bipartisan. It was passed in 2017 under the Trump administration. So we would think, wow, how could something like that happen? But it was really through the work of women on both sides of the aisle and some men who know that equality, gender equality, equality between men and women is really intrinsic to our peace and security. So I might stop there. There's much more to be said about it. The act requires strategies also by the administration, and the next one is due later, sometime in 2023. So I think that's also very important for us to keep an eye on.
Well, thank you, Sahana. And of course, this means that in the decisions that the State Department, Defense Department, USAID, et cetera, take, that they are incorporating a gender lens into those decisions in peace and security. And that's many of the conflicts that are circumventing our globe today. So Afghanistan is women, peace, and security, as is Ukraine, as is Myanmar. So this is very real in terms of policymaking. Let's turn now to Dr. Kathleen Cunest, who is the Director of Gender Policy and Strategy at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She brings both scholarship and field experience to focus on the different gendered impacts of conflict and violence. She's the co-editor of Women in War, Power and Protection in the 21st Century. Earlier, she worked in international development for 15 years, primarily with the World Bank. Kathleen, it's wonderful to have you with us as well. You have studied and worked with women peace builders at the grassroots level. And today we have an evidence-based case that documents the differences women are able to make in mediating and peacemaking at the local level. And yet those experiences, their knowledge, their mediation efforts rarely make it to the formal peace processes. And we see that in terms of the number of negotiators, signatories to agreements, that there are still very few women in those positions. And yet there is so much knowledge and experience that they can bring to the table. So, and we also know that at least half the agreements fail in the first 5 years because the real issues that need to be addressed are often off the table and not addressed. So what is being lost when we don't include women in formal negotiations? How is sustainable peace not being able to be built because of their marginalization? What can turn this situation around?
Thank you so much, Milan, and greetings to my fellow panelists. And thank you also to the Women's Foreign Policy Group and Alexa. These are tough questions, especially as I reflect on our earlier meeting today, looking at Afghanistan and the predicament there for women. Every day, as we know, their rights are being stripped away. And yet there was a peace process that went along, and there was many, many efforts to get women, first of all, at various tables. There are many tables. We have to remember that. Women are constantly working in community to help better their local situation and then moving it forward. But clearly what we're losing is the real focus at the ground level of how society works. Women are key interlocutors in terms of education, economics, making sure that communication is laid out. And, you know, I think we have even studies done by the UN, women and their partners, that we really are behind the curve. Having said that, I just want to reinforce your opening remarks, Milan. This is a long journey we have. We've been at it for a couple of decades at least. The fact that we have these agreements and that many of the countries in this world have agreed to women, peace, and security, have national action plans. We are making progress. It takes a long time to change our language, and we have always thought of war as a domain of men. So it makes sense that the peace process, the ending of war, had become the domain of men. And I think as we gain certainly a younger set of male allies who understand the difference women can make at all parts of the peace process, I think we will see change, but we have many, many challenges ahead. I would just bring into line recently at the US Institute of Peace, we had, I would say, probably one of the most successful female negotiators join us for conversation. So sorry, Miriam Coronel Ferrer was a key Filipino negotiator with the government of the Philippines, looking at the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro with the Mora Islamic Liberation Front, the MILF. Many of you maybe have heard about it. Sorry. She brought new angles into the conversation as she reflected on her role in that comprehensive agreement. She said, you know, women really focus less on the spoils of war and more on the process of reconciliation, economic advancement, education, transitional justice. But she also said, we often forget, even in our own desire to have participation, that each generation of women have different priorities, and that we must, you know, not only have women at the table, but we need that intersecting identities that Sahana was talking about earlier, because often younger women in the post-war predicament, they want to go back to school. For other women in more middle age, they want to start a small business, and maybe an older generation is wanting more civic programs. Having said all this, she said, again, that being at the table is critical, but we can't only elevate the peace table. We need to keep reminding people that we need women in all parts of the process. And having male allies is a credible process to making sure women's issues are a part of it. But there is no doubt, there is no substitute for women who are there and can speak up about these issues. USIP has been very involved in the peace process in Colombia. You may have known Jenny Bouvier, who really started this effort at USIP and has been carried on by Tonis Montez. But it is long, it is hard. We recently awarded Maria Eugenia Mosquera Riascos the Women Building Peace Award for her on the ground work. She did eventually get to be a part of the Colombia peace deal in Havana, and in that process was able to begin laying out at least 130 of the Accord's 578 provisions specifically address gender issues. And I'll stop here because we certainly want to hear from Ivana, but we do need to count these things. It is so important that the research has identified how many women in each part of these processes, and not only the process at the table, but that in the provisions, gender issues are addressed. So and those kind of provisions take years to develop. They are not an overnight thing. And so we need women at all the tables along the way.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. And the two cases you mentioned in Mindanao in the Philippines and in Colombia were among the best processes in terms of bringing everyone into the process and outreach, strong outreach to the civil society as well, so that there was a sense of total inclusion in all segments of society. We're now going to turn to Ivana Klimpushzadze. She is in Kiev, and we're hoping that the transmission is going to work. You know that Ukraine's power grid has been struck repeatedly by Russian missile attacks, but we're hoping that we're going to have Ivana with us by telephone at least. She is a member of the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, and chair of the Committee on Ukraine's integration into the European Union. Previously, she served as Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. She's been a leader for women's equal opportunity, an active member of the Equal Opportunity Caucus, and the trips I've made to Ukraine in the past, she's always been front and center and vocal and active on these issues. She herself entered politics after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, after years of working in civil society. Ivana has been a strong advocate for defensive weapons to overcome Russia's brutal assault on Ukraine. Ivana, can you hear me?
Yes, Milan. Yes,
Okay.
very well.
Well, let me ask you, your presence with us on this panel really brings to our audience the hard reality of war front and center into this discussion. Tell us about what women, role they're playing in Ukraine, from the security sector to humanitarian relief, to the role of policymakers like yourself. Ukraine has a national action plan on women, peace, and security. In fact, its second revision, its second installment of the plan is being implemented and integrated across all ministries. And in fact, I know that you have a special appointee established in a position to ensure implementation. So we're so grateful for your being with us, and we're eager to hear what the situation is and how women are participating in defending their homeland.
Well, thank you very much, dear Milan, dear Alexa. I'm grateful for this invitation, and I'm terribly sorry that at this particular moment, it is exactly the electricity is not available in my home. The problem is that we here in Ukraine are predominantly right now, after massive attacks of the Russian Federation on our civilian energy infrastructure, we are spending usually from 12 to 16 hours per day without electricity. So right now it's our turn. So, but I'm grateful for this invitation, and I'm grateful for the warm words that you have mentioned with regard to how Ukraine was progressing on women, peace, and security agenda, basically from the start of the war back in 2014. And it's important to understand that we were the first country in the world that has adopted the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security during the war. Just a reminder that this war has been ongoing 8 years and 9 months since the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation. And you're absolutely right when you're saying that definitely women are disproportionately targeted and suffering from war. And that's exactly the case, because among the millions of refugees, and we do not want to call them refugees. We hope that these are externally and internally displaced people, because we are hoping that they all will return.
Oh dear. Let's see if we can reconnect with her. Rose, I'm going to turn to you, and then hopefully we'll get Ivana back on, if that's okay with you.
Yes, certainly. Please go ahead, Milan.
Rose Gottmaler was the first woman and second American to serve as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. She has been instrumental in moving NATO forward in adapting to the new security challenges in Europe, and tremendously supportive of NATO's Women, Peace, and Security National Action Plan, or I should say NATO Action Plan. Earlier, Rose served as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and the International Security and International Security at the State Department. And from 2009 to 2010, as the Chief US Negotiator of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with Russia, the New START. Today, she's currently the Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute and a Hoover Fellow. Rose, we're really thrilled to have you on this panel as well, because you give us yet another dimension on women, peace, and security. It's among your many responsibilities when you were number 2 at NATO. You oversaw the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, often seen as soft power in a very hard power institution. NATO also has a special representative for women, peace, and security to the NATO Secretary General. So tell us how the Women, Peace, and Security framework was in your time too important to NATO's overall mission, perhaps an example of its impact and making NATO that much more effective.
Very good. Milan, I note that Ivana apparently has joined us again. Perhaps we should simply resume, and you've already introduced me, so then I can dive in when Ivana's finished. Does that sound
Perfect.
good?
Ivana, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Hi.
Pick up
Thank
where
you.
you were.
Yes, thank you so much. So we are in this war for a long time, but definitely the hardship and the pressure and the scale of the war at this particular moment is huge. And 7 million of refugees who left the country predominantly are women, but also 11 million of internally displaced people also predominantly consist of women and children as well. So this is the first and immediate thing that you see, but definitely Ukrainian women are part of the struggle, of the fight that Ukraine is giving to the aggressor at this particular moment. And we can proudly say that now 20% of our armed forces are women, and they are actually in military positions, and they are doing very, very different things, starting from being snipers and operators of special commanders of special anti-tank handheld systems of different missiles, and to going and also being paramedics and medics and those who are helping others on the front. We also have a lot of women who have already survived captivity, but also a lot of them, both from the armed forces, but also from the civilians, from the community leaders, from activists, from volunteers who have been taken into captivity, and we do not have access to them, neither do international organizations, humanitarian organizations, and this is a very, very worrisome thing, because we see how Russian Federation is abusing the Geneva Conventions and is not letting even international organizations, humanitarian organizations, to visit the detainees or prisoners of war. But at the same time, women are also keeping the backbone of both a humanitarian effort, and I think that the world has heard a lot about different horizontal volunteer initiatives that have been forming from the very first days of this war back in 2014, but which have scaled up and new have been popping up since the 24th of February of this year, when the full-scale invasion has started. Women are also playing a very serious role right now in our economy, because they are taking care of relocating the enterprises from the kind of front lines or more vulnerable regions to rare regions, and reestablishing their enterprises there in order to keep the economy running and in order to also provide for their families. And they are coordinating also a lot of humanitarian efforts and humanitarian aid, and launching different social, educational, or psychological, medical initiatives. Whatever you can think of is already being taken being taken care of by Ukrainian women, and we are definitely, also part of the international diplomatic effort on different levels, starting from official diplomacy, because we have quite a few women ambassadors who actually in the U.S. we have a fantastic woman who is ambassador from Ukraine to the United States and other key countries, also to NATO. At this particular moment, we have a woman who is our ambassador to NATO. And also we have a lot of women parliamentarians who, from the very first days of this full-scale invasion, when men were not allowed to leave the country, also men MPs, we were the only ones who went out to ask for additional support and assistance to raise the awareness of actually what is going on here. But that is also translated to a lot of different activities on the non-governmental level, and we have a lot of women who are trying to help the country with reaching out to international audiences, to different countries, and we are very grateful for all the support that we are getting. But you, Milan, at the very beginning have mentioned about sexual violence as being used as a weapon of war, and that's definitely something that we've seen here, conducted by the Russian armed forces. And just to tell you one example, we have a special commission in the Parliament of Ukraine that is looking right now on those cases of recorded already cases of the violence, sexual violence, and it's not only against women but also against men, but also against children. And the youngest case of sexual violence that we've recorded is the person was 4 years of age, and the oldest one that is recorded and is being investigated at this particular moment is 82 years of age. So that means that the scope of the war crimes that we will have to deal with, the scope of the crimes against humanity and actually acts of genocide against Ukrainian people is absolutely huge. It's more than 47,000 already opened criminal cases against different war crimes that have been carried out here on the territory of Ukraine by occupiers. So that's why we need all the efforts, from all the society inside Ukraine, but also from our partners, to ensure that we are defeating this this evil. And I think that one of the U.S. presidents, I think it was Reagan, who called then Soviet Union the empire of evil, has actually was very, very right, because Russia has just carried on this evil policy and evil actions at this particular moment. We have to defeat Russia. We have to weaken it, to isolate it, but also to punish. And there we have a lot to do, both men and women. And I'm sure that women will be playing, from Ukraine, will be playing a serious role in all of these processes, as they are already. But at the same time, we still see that we have a lack of women at the highest positions where the decision making is being done in terms of potential negotiations. But at this particular moment, unfortunately, here in Ukraine, we are far from negotiations. We just have to continue fighting in order to survive.
Well, Ivana, thank you for that brief report about the situation. I was going to ask you secondly about the sexual violence reports that are coming out about systematic rape that's going on. And you mentioned one of the NGO leaders in Ukraine just received the Nobel Peace Prize this week in Oslo. And Alexandra Matvichuk called for the establishment of an international tribunal. Do you have anything to say about that? Because what she is saying and what others are saying is that process really needs to start now as the documentation is taking place, as survivors are being treated for their trauma, for their injuries. There's an awful lot that needs to be happening now to deal with these horrors that people are experiencing.
There are international judicial platforms such as ICC and ICJ. However, these platforms are dealing exclusively with war crimes in order to ensure that the leadership of the country that is conducting and channeling all these crimes that are happening on our territory right now is brought to justice. We need to ensure that a international tribunal is established in order to have Russian authorities being punished for the crime of aggression, which is called one of the crimes of the crimes. And that process needs to be established by goodwill of different countries across the world that would have to come out with the special international treaty establishing that particular international tribunal. And we believe that this is exactly the case which would allow first to bring the authorities and the leadership of the Russian Federation to justice in much shorter period of time that some of the war crimes usually take, and also would allow to carry it from there to ensure that every single person who has been engaged in committing crimes on the territory, war crimes and crimes against humanity and crimes of genocide on our territory would be punished. It takes a lot of work. It takes political will. It takes courage to establish such an international tribunal. But I'm grateful that we are all from different fronts are trying to persuade our partners that this is time already to establish that could actually help to stop the war much earlier than it might go on.
Well, thank you so much, Ivana, for hanging in with us and for the technology for staying with us as well. Be well, be safe, and we can't thank you enough for your extraordinary leadership. So thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you.
Rose, now back to you and the impacts of this framework for NATO.
Well, thank you so much again, Milan, and I'm just so pleased to be on with all my colleagues, but Ivana Klimpach-Sinadze was an excellent partner while I was NATO DSG. We worked together so often, and Ivana, I'm so glad to hear you on this call today, and just wanted to convey my very best wishes and gratitude for the important work you and all your colleagues are doing in Ukraine.
Thank you.
So in any event, I wanted to just begin with the point, and Ivana made the great point about how women are actually serving so actively in the Ukrainian armed forces, and what a contrast with the army of the Russian Federation, the armed forces of the Russian Federation. You can see, I think it's a great symbol of how modernized and effective the Ukrainian armed forces have become in the last years, certainly since 2014 and the invasion of Crimea. Certainly NATO played a role there, and I was very proud of the training that NATO was doing for the Ukrainian armed forces. Canadian members of NATO, of course, with their large Ukrainian community, played a big role there, but a number of NATO countries, including the United States, were very active in training. But the fact that women are now serving in the armed forces throughout, even in combat roles, which frankly, even for many member states of NATO, it's difficult to have women serving in combat roles. That's not their tradition, but they are beginning to incorporate that throughout their armed forces. And Ukraine has been a real leader in this regard, I would say, as NATO's partner. I also wanted to just remark that I had a visit of a female unit to NATO when I was NATO DSG. One of the women had lost her leg. She was there in a wheelchair. This was a unit who had been fighting in the Donbass prior to the current phase. So this was in the period after 2014. And while I was serving at NATO between 2016 and 19, they came to visit me at NATO and recounted their experience serving in the Ukrainian armed forces, and truly were, right in there with the combat roles once again. And so I think it's something really to be proud of for Ukraine. I am going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what's going on at NATO, because I'm also very proud of that. When I got to NATO once again as the DSG, honestly, 1325, yeah, it was thrown into the talking points, but it was always at the end of the list and didn't get talked about very much. And we did have the Secretary General's advisor, as you noted, Milan, but not many staff, not much of an organization for her to work with. She did the best she could, but I give Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg a lot of credit that he gave more resources to that office, was able to build up the role. And we had some strong gender advisors who were able to push the military organization at NATO and the international military staff to take more, I would say, real-time interest in this issue in a way that would incorporate the gender perspective in all aspects of NATO military activity, including NATO education and training. And I think that has really paid off. The IMS, the International Military Staff Office of the Gender Advisor, is now extremely active. I was just looking at the website to prepare for this talk today, and they are doing deep dives on a monthly basis. The most recent one, you can look at the NATO website and see this. It was a deep dive on resilience and the role of gender in resilience in the NATO alliance, and talking about how women really do provide for resilience in preparing for conflict and crisis. I'm sure Ivana once again can testify to that women are the ones who often provide individual resilience into a family setting, to help a family to be ready and able to cope with conflict and crisis. Also, how women, so often we saw this in Afghanistan as well, they are the early warning. They provide the early warning of gender violence, gender attacks of all kinds in the community. They can really help to prepare and perhaps ward off attacks of that kind. And so I think it's fascinating what the military advisor at NATO has been doing in this regard. And again, I commend those of you who are interested enough to go on the NATO website, because it shows that there's a lot going on, again, in the education and training side. And it doesn't always come naturally to NATO member states. I mentioned that a moment ago, but, particularly states, former members of the Warsaw Pact, even some longstanding NATO members, it doesn't come easy for them to incorporate women into their armed forces, and particularly in combat roles. But they are committed to doing so now, and certainly I would say that across NATO, there's been huge progress since, and I don't take credit for this. This is, again, Jens Stoltenberg. I certainly did what I could to push it along, but my successor, Mircea Joana, is also continuing to push this agenda very hard and to ensure that NATO is paying attention. So the last thing I will say here is that I've noted recently, including in the summit documents from Madrid last summer, that the 1325 agenda and the issues related to women, peace, and security were much higher up on the list. They got some good attention in the talking points, including in some of the action plans that were agreed. And I do think that that is a big change for NATO over the last 5 years. So I'm very proud of that. And again, I'm actually quite surprised and pleased looking at what the international military staff is doing now, and urge you, if you're interested, to check out the NATO website.
Thank you so much, Rose. That was just excellent. And, you know, you're talking about the women in the security sector in Ukraine reminded me that back in 2014, when Russia invaded in the East, women were going volunteering and in combat roles, but they were not officially recognized as being in the security sector. So they had no benefits, no possibilities in their future. And they were called the Invisible Battalion. And it was through this process of women, peace, and security, the work of the international community, et cetera, that really changed the situation in Ukraine to the point where, as Ivana said, more than 20% of the security sector today is female. So, you know, we can take some collective pride in the fact that there is some progress. I want to ask, excuse me, I want to ask Sahana about where the Department of Defense is in terms of implementing women, peace, and security. As you pointed out, we've got a law now, and yet there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of progress when it comes to what's happening at the Pentagon, although some combatant commands are doing a better job, but we still seem to be very, very slow in making progress in this space.
Thanks, Malin, and thanks, Ivana, for your courage and your kind offer to spend time with us when you're going through what you're going through. Really appreciate it. So yeah, Department of Defense, State Department, USAID. I think that one of the challenges of the Act is all the agencies are required to put together implementation plans and strategies, and they have, and I think all the agencies have very dedicated people inside the institutions trying to work on these issues. I think one of the challenges is a structural challenge, an operational challenge within each institution. We can have the most dedicated gender advisors and have a strategy that's been signed off at the top. But if you don't have operational guidance or in DoD instructions that embed these the actions and the policy that people throughout the institution are supposed to take in order to implement and execute on these goals and objectives, it becomes very limited what can be achieved. So as you said, we can see a lot of action in combatant commands. We can see individual champions across professional military education institutions. We can see individual champions in different, missions or defense efforts or security cooperation efforts. But a lot of times those are driven by the dedication of the male ally or the gender advisors or the people that are staffing it, because we don't have the operational policy or the DoD instructions embedded that requires the whole chain of command, the hierarchy, to implement and execute at every level, strategic, operational, tactical, right? I think that is one of the major challenges. And I think it's the same, at state and USAID as well. If you don't have strong internal operational guidance for all of your staff and from the top to the bottom, it's really difficult to live up to these aspirational goals. One of the things that I'm really proud of that we've done in our Secure Future is try to stand up a bipartisan congressional caucus on the Hill now consisting of 25 members, both Republican and Democrat. This will be the third Congress that they're active in, to actually provide a place where we're trying to do a little bit more, maybe oversight might be a strong word, but actually look into, take a pulse on how is DoD doing, how is state executing, how is USA doing, to the DHS on these commitments. The other thing I wanted to mention with Ivana and Rose talking is we mentioned early warning, and you mentioned also, Melan, the invisible battalion. In 2014, like many other conflicts around the world, women's civil society actors actually usually are the first to be very vocal about what is happening on the ground. They are early warning sign, women's civil society. The unfortunate thing, the unfortunate place we are still in today with the lack of implementation is not being able to take those women's civil society seriously when they are telling us very early on in fragile environments what is happening, and integrate their recommendations, their insights into our own policymaking and strategy, right? So I think there's a couple of things going on that are structural, but also, in our way of doing things that could be changed, maybe internal gender bias, individual gender bias as well. But I do think the key for DoD would be to have, and maybe across agencies, is we all know strong political will is necessary, but you need to have that structural component. And defense relies on that chain of command to execute. So without that instruction, it's very difficult to move things forward, I think, in the way that we'd like to see. But I do think that one of the key things here, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Myanmar, all of these places, China, right? That when women on the ground are telling us there is something wrong, that the environment is getting more repressive, that women's rights are being restricted, that that they're seeing fragility in a lot of different ways, and we don't listen, that's on us. Like, we are not really internalizing, taking that information into account in our decision making. And I think that is a key component of women, peace, and security that we are still very weak on. So with the Hill, the bipartisan caucus, we would like to bring more of these voices to the Hill and to the American public, so that we, don't end up in a situation that we let a conflict go on and on and on until it escalates to this point. That actually women are trying to say we can do something about this before it gets to these really dire straits. So,
and I think as Rose pointed out too, and you just did, the leadership at the top really matters. It mattered at NATO, and it will matter across governments in this instance. We're very close to running out of time before we go to the Q&A. So I want to ask Kathleen and then Rose. First, Kathleen, maybe briefly you can talk about, because you've spent a lot of time writing about this transition, when a conflict actually ends, when a war ends and you transition into the recovery and a reconstruction period. Why is that so critical? And why is women's meaningful participation economically, politically, et cetera, so critical to a sustainable peace, so that we don't go in a situation where everybody's back to fighting again?
Yeah, no, there is that opportunity, especially as the peace agreements are signed, where the society is still in many ways formation, coming out of one identity, hasn't quite created the post-conflict identity, when women's roles need to be amplified, secured, their rights. We have Afghanistan as the counter. What happens, and certainly what happened as the international community left Afghanistan. it is critical that these rights are held tight, and because they are the ticket for economic stability, for education, and for the long-term peace. To imagine peace without engaging women is just not logical. I mean, it's out of a logic sequence. We need as many people at the table for rebuilding a society as possible. I have often quoted in these kinds of moments that even though, and I keep bringing up Afghanistan because I think many of us feel quite helpless, and I bring it up because it's important that we don't forget it. But we do have to keep preparing for change, for their future as well. And, you know, in addition to the situation in Ukraine, how do we prepare for when there is peace? One of the big issues will have to be addressed: the number of arms in the country, the corruption that arms we know bring, the issues of trafficking, and all of those need to be a part of how we plan for a transition, not only in legal dimensions, but in the social dimensions that Ivana was talking about as well. The importance of addressing the psychological impacts of war and helping people learn resilience in coming out. It is critical, and women must be a part of that entire journey. I'll stop there, knowing our
Yeah.
time is short.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned Ukraine, because clearly, pray God, this horrible war will end. It is important to have the participation of women for the sake of the future economy and the political success of the country going forward. Rose, I know you have to leave us almost immediately, but before you go, just one quick question. You have really been one of the top leaders, top female leaders in the security sector, certainly at NATO and as an arms control negotiator. These are spaces that in which women still are rarely seen. But why is diversity in these kinds of situations important? And what lessons can you give us on that?
Well, I think it's some of the same messages we've been hearing from Sahana and Kathleen about why women are so important, and from you, Milan, why women are so important in peace negotiations. It's that they are the ones looking for the problem solving. They are the ones that are not ready to leave the table until they've figured out some solution that works for at least the majority of people around the table. I always think about my experience negotiating the New START treaty. Yeah, there were lots of games that went on. My Russian counterpart was a great games player, but I never let his little games get in the way of trying to figure out the way to the next step, and tended to use humor a lot to try to jolt the momentum if it needed to be jolted. I don't think women are afraid. Sometimes maybe a man thinks he's going to look dumb if he tells a joke in a serious moment when you're butting heads and having a little fight, and your whole delegation is watching you. But I thought, well, let's get ourselves out of this death trap we're in and get on to the next thing. And I never really cared that much if I, quote, lost face, unquote. It was getting through to the solution and getting through to the next phase and building up the building blocks of what became the New START treaty. So I just think women have a different attitude maybe toward pragmatic problem solving, and maybe don't care as much about about, well, I'll just say their ego. I'll put it that way. But that's my opinion and based on my experience. And I wish I could stay and hear what Ivana, Kathleen, and Sahana have to say, as well as you, who have been through plenty of this yourself. But I have to get on to another event, so I'm really sorry to leave you all, but it's been a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Well, it's been an honor to have you with us, Rose, and I think we all agree with you in terms of the characteristics women often bring to these thorny situations. So
Exactly.
thank you. And we're going to move to the audience Q&A. I wonder, Ivana, you're still hanging with us? Do you have anything to
Yes,
say
I'm here.
before we move to the Q&A and the audience questions, or should we just go into those?
Let's go into questions.
Okay, Alexa, can you give us the first question, please?
Of course, we have a question from Olga Sharp. Could you comment on the slogan, Women, Life, Freedom, that has begun from Iran, how this can contribute to women, peace, and security policy in the Middle East?
Does anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I might start by saying, well, obviously what's happening in Iran with women's rights and the massive movement is definitely very related to women, peace, and security. I think, we go back to the same principles of what are women saying? What are they challenging? Usually women are challenging power systems that are unequal and that actually are not good for democratic governance. That is the heart of democratic values are human rights, women's rights. If you can't participate fully in society, do you really have a free and open and democratic society? And I think it's really important to see that women in Iran are saying, this is what we want, right? And for people to see that, first of all, women, peace, and security was never a Western agenda. It came from women in the global South, all over the world, who are saying, we care about our rights and we want them to be protected and we want to have a voice and to be able to make decisions about our own lives. And I think it's a carry through of what women everywhere are facing. I'm not trying to minimize it by saying that, but I think it's very reflective of women's movements and what women's social justice movements do and what they're asking for is this demand for respect, dignity, full participation, decision-making over their own lives.
The women in Iran have a long, rich history of engagement and leadership and brought about many reforms in the country, even struggling with the regime in power. But the regime has obviously adopted a policy of gender apartheid, where they are second-class citizens, regulating what they wear, what public events they can go to or not go to. And it's really interesting that this protest is now in its third month, and it's been joined by men. It's had strong leadership from young people, students, the universities, and various economic sectors of Iran. So there's a lot cascading here. We obviously don't know where it heads, but I think the world is in solidarity with much that is happening there. Kathleen, did you want to add anything? We can move on otherwise. Alexa, do we have another question?
We do. This one is from Mindy Cutler, and it's on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Do you think the US Congress will pass it in the next Congress?
Do the panelists want to weigh in? If not, I will. I've long been part of this process. We are the only industrialized country in the world. Frankly, it's down to about it's down to the United States and maybe 4 other pariah states, including Iran, that have not ratified the Equality of Women Treaty. That's what this is, to eliminate discrimination against women. It requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and we have not been able to muster that. And I don't know what it will take. I have testified, others have testified, but so often members will say, well, look at some of the countries that have ratified. They're in terrible shape. They're not as good as the United States in terms of advancing women. But the reality is that in those countries, they hold their governments responsible under this treaty. And it's one of the most effective tools that civil society has to try to fully eliminate discrimination against women in those societies. So it's a really important tool. I remember, speaking of Afghanistan, going to the Minister of Justice for why the government wasn't implementing the violence against women law. And he went into all kinds of discourse about Sharia law and other reasons. And I finally, in exasperation, said to him, but Mr. Minister, your government has ratified CEDAW. And he said, well, I keep telling those people down at the foreign ministry not to ratify these treaties because they're just a problem for us. So they really are a critical tool. The United States should be on the side of this. And it is inexcusable, but I don't see it happening anytime soon, regrettably.
I concur, regrettably.
Another question?
Another question. This is from Jennifer Engel. She's a young professional and up and coming star, and I must add, part of the WFPG staff. She writes, for years, WPS activists have been calling for demilitarization to achieve more security. Now, the war in Ukraine, for example, requires arms to be sent in support of security. How can these two approaches to women in security be balanced?
Maybe we should go to Ivana on this.
Well, we've been trying to explain that the best and major humanitarian aid for Ukraine is actually sending weapons to Ukraine in order for us to be able to protect ourselves, to protect civilians, to regain our territories, to liberate our people that have been occupied by the evil power. And I think it just goes absolutely logically because unfortunately, we still have the states that do not want to exercise the laws, the rules, the UN statutes, other conventions that they are signatories to, and they totally disregard anything that was agreed upon. And therefore, in order to live, in order to survive, in order to ensure that, for example, Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian state is preserved, we need weapons, and that is for life. It might sound contradictory, but I think it's absolutely logical, because without weapons, we don't have a chance to live. Without weapons, we don't have a chance to exercise our rights, because definitely, as Rose was pointing out, we are totally different societies from the Russian one to Ukrainian one. When we see how women are engaged in our society, and when we see the role that they are playing in our society in comparison to the Russian Federation, including in the armed forces, including in the security sector, including in politics or in civil society, in economy, we can tell that we differ immensely, as we really, as you, Milan, were saying very rightly. Since 2014, we opened up so many possibilities to women. We finally made it possible for them not to be the invisible battalion by taking part in action, but not being given, not having credit for that role that they have been playing before. So therefore, from my perspective, in order to preserve peace in this part of the world, but I also think that this war has a direct impact on the whole globe, we have to use weapons because you cannot stand up naked against barbarians, against disaster and this total monster that is trying to conquer another nation and that is trying to change the whole rule-based order in the world. If we want to preserve it, we need weapons.
Go ahead, Sahana. Thank you, Ivana.
I want to totally agree with Ivana and maybe take a slightly different approach that might be, a 30,000-foot view. But listen, women, peace, and security is a very pragmatic agenda. It's meant to be applied. It's not an academic thing. It came from women in conflict zones who were just like Ivana in the middle of it. And we know national defense is necessary for sovereign states. That's just a fact. Maybe that won't be a fact 100 years from now or 200 years from now, but the world that we live in, we have sovereign states that protect their borders. And we can have also sovereign states that have good relationships with each other. And as we can see in Ukraine, sovereign states that actually, illegally invade others. So women is, I think the way to think about women, peace, and security here is, yes, women peace builders. There are many that advocate for demilitarization, but that's not very pragmatic. Instead, I would look to women, peace, and security's requirement for a gender perspective to understand what are security risks, threats, priorities, because that's actually transformative in institutions. If we can get people in our security institutions to listen to women earlier about early warning signals, to really understand what we're seeing economically, health-wise, education-wise, socially, as indicators of escalating violence that women often report much earlier, right, but are not taken seriously or not looked at as reporting security threats or weaknesses. If we did that, that's women, peace, and security, using a gender perspective to understand what is the actual situation we're in, and then actually opening up your policy toolbox to more options of how to act. But I don't think that it's realistic or helpful to say we don't need national defense. We will always need that. I mean, I think in our lifetime anyway, we will always need national defense of a sovereign state. And it's a necessary thing for a state interest. So, and I think, we wouldn't be talking about inclusion of women's participation in security sector if we didn't believe that we needed that, right? But we also need different perspectives, different capabilities within that security sector. And I think that is what the Women, Peace, and Security lens really brings.
Kathleen, do you want to add anything as we bring the panel to a close?
Well, I just am noticing that there is another question for Ivana, and I think it's an important one, but I'll just underline the fact that it is women, peace, and security. Security has always been about this story. And yes, we want women a part of the peace process, but we also want them informing the security process, whether it's formal or informal. And clearly, Ukraine is having women engaged in all aspects of the formal and informal security process. But I think this question for Ivana, if we have a few more minutes, Milan.
Yeah, Alexa, can you give us the question?
Of course, it's from Linda Robinson for Ivana, and then she has a part 2 for the others. Part 1, for Ivana, has President Zelensky committed to robust representation of women at the eventual peace talks, and has this issue been raised? And for the others, what is the most important element lacking that should be addressed in the 2023 update of the WPS strategy?
Good questions. Ivana, you had mentioned how critical it's going to be when we reach that point in Ukraine where there is an actual negotiated peace. But what is the status of women in that process to come?
for someone who probably is watching closely the whole development of this war, for those people who are watching closely, they might recall that back in March, immediately when Kyiv, where I live, was almost encircled by Russian troops, and at that point there were some kind of negotiations. And unfortunately, in the group of people who represented Ukraine, the negotiations team from on the Ukrainian side, there was no single woman at that particular moment. So, well, there's no ground for negotiations, as I previously mentioned, at this particular moment, because all the calls from the Russian Federation on negotiations at this time, at this part of the war, is just a smokescreen, because they are trying to get some rest, because they are getting military defeats in different parts of the front, and that's why they are using terror against the whole civilian population of Ukraine, just trying to sow some panic and some humanitarian disaster, so that people would turn against the government and ask for negotiations. But they're getting totally opposite result. So I do not see that the approach actually in terms of this highest level decision making has changed at this particular moment in Ukraine. So the issue has been raised quite a few times already, but at this moment, I think we still have work to do in order to ensure that when we come and every single war gets to an end with some diplomatic solution, and this one probably won't be an exclusion, so that at that table there should be women that would represent Ukraine, and I hope that will be the case. But not at this moment. My feeling is not there yet.
Well, we and others will be pushing forward, and I know you and your colleagues will as well. Quickly, Sahana and Kathleen, anything to add on what we can do with the next iteration of the 1325 strategy in the United States?
On this one, and I'm going to bring it back to conflict-related sexual violence. The UK government just hosted their 10th anniversary of trying to address this war, this form of war, this form of violence, which is incredibly destructive. I think one of the things that is missing in WPS is that link with atrocity prevention and conflict-related sexual violence, that these things are interrelated, that once we see any kind of CRSV, we must be alerted as a red flag to atrocities that may be committed. We have seen this in many parts of the world over many years. I think that link has to happen, and it has to happen with parts of our government who train other militaries, police, peacekeepers. This is a tool, a weapon of war. It's cheap and it's very destructive. This is not a woman's issue. This is a security issue and must be raised in our work, especially with security actors that we train and that we engage in.
Sahana?
I think, well, for the 2023 strategy, I think we just need to really keep pushing on implementation and getting political will. I think we do definitely want to see some stronger language linking WPS to the national security strategy, because the national security strategy is very weak on WPS and gender equality. But I would also say to the audience, I think we need to push for an amendment to the WPS Act, because there's no requirement after 2023 to continue to do strategies, to continue to do implementation plans. So that could be a very easy amendment to require every 2 to 4 years to have strategies. But if we don't get that amendment, it's going to be very difficult to really push or count on these strategies to continue to evolve.
Well, thank you all. It's been a robust discussion by our panelists, and we're grateful to Rose, of course, who has had to leave a little bit, to Sahana, Kathleen, and Ivana. Stay well, and we will continue to advocate with you as you go through these difficult days.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to ask
Thank you.
Alexa if the representative of the United Arab Emirates is with us. Oh, there she is. I want to welcome Shema Gorgash, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy, UAE Embassy here in Washington. Thank you for joining us, Shema. I know firsthand that the UAE has been playing a key role in the WPS framework. We at the Georgetown Institute have worked closely with your mission at the United Nations on a series of programs looking at various aspects of WPS. I know you just had a enormous global conference in Abu Dhabi that regrettably I couldn't make, but I understand it was very productive. Can you give us some insights into how the UAE is looking at this framework and how you are moving forward with it?
Thank you, Ambassador Verveer, and thank you, WFPG, for including the UAE in this. As you've mentioned, Ambassador Verveer, we've worked close with your organization, and the WPS agenda is a key foreign policy priority for the UAE. And this September, the UAE government, in partnership with the United Nations, hosted the MENA region's first high-level International Conference for Women, Peace and Security in Abu Dhabi, highlighting the UAE's leadership on implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And the attendees, comprised of, policymakers, senior officials, diplomats, and women advocates. And the conference served as a firm call to action and a solid reminder that women must be an integral part of the security landscape to achieve peace, as everyone else has mentioned. The WPS was a core focus of the UAE's term on the UN Security Council and its 2022 UN Security Council presidency. UAE ambassador to the United Nations, Lanan Seba, who you've worked closely with, has long been a fierce advocate for women in peacekeeping as well. And the UAE leadership holds the fundamental belief that women must be considered agents of their own progress and equal partners in peace and security efforts. And I'm just kind of reiterating what everyone else is talking about, the importance of it. And since 2019, through the Sheikha Fatma bint Mubarak WPS initiative, the UAE has trained more than 350 female cadets from 18 countries across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia for various military and peacekeeping roles. And since 2016, the UAE has committed to more than $2 billion to various programs related to the protection of women in more than 70 countries. And the UAE is a regional champion in the WPS space. And in 2021, the UAE was the first country in the GCC to enact a national action plan for the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And this plan aims to empower and support women globally by promoting, adhering to the resolution 1325. And the UAE is highly ranked country in the MENA region on the 2021-2022 WPS Index by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. The UAE came in 24th, and we're proud, of the UAE's efforts in this front. And, significant progress has been made on the WPS agenda globally, but obviously much more work remains to be done. Gender equality provisions in peace agreements increased from only 14% in 1995 to 23% in 2020. And women made up only 25% of members among COVID-19 task forces in 36 conflict and post-conflict countries. The international community has the collective responsibility to live up to what has been promised to women and girls by the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and other groundbreaking resolutions adopted over the last 2 decades. And, we all talk about it, but this is the right move, not only for women, for men, and also for peace.
Thank you for that. And just very quickly before we close, we all know that climate change is increasingly a security issue.
Mhm.
and there's a real nexus with climate, gender, and conflict. You and the UAE will be hosting COP28, the next big meeting on climate change. And I know from what some of your leaders have already indicated that you plan to really put a focus of gender on the climate issue, which is still fairly marginalized as best. Can you just say a little bit about the upcoming plans with respect to climate change and the next COP?
Thank you. Well, women's leadership and engagement are key to tackling climate change. And as UN Women reports, climate change affects women disproportionately. And at the same time, women are especially well positioned to provide leadership towards a greener world. And in line with the UN SDG 5, climate solutions must incorporate female perspectives and place women's livelihoods, health, and safety at the forefront. And at COP28, the UAE will host an inclusive climate conference, bringing together all stakeholders for a transparent and honest conversation about what is needed to deliver a joint action. And women will be central to this, as our country's climate leadership demonstrates, from our Minister of Climate Change and Environment to our representatives in multilateral bodies to the UAE's chief climate negotiator. Female government leaders are playing a key role to preserve the planet. And at the local level, women are on the cutting edge of actions to expand awareness and sustainability, implement recycling, and build smart cities that reduce waste. And internationally, Masdar's Wiser initiative, Women in Sustainability, Environment, and Renewable Energy, empowers women as drivers of change to address the sustainability challenges, which was recently discussed at COP27 last month.
Well, thank you for that and for all that you're doing in this space. I'm going to turn the baton back to Alexa to bring this to a close.
Thank you, Milan, for anchoring and moderating this phenomenal discussion. To our all-star speakers, Rose Gottmuller, Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadze, Kathleen Keenest, and Sahana Dharmapuri, our sincere gratitude and appreciation for sharing your insights and time with us today. We are ready to look forward to our future work together. Thank you to our event partner, the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates in the United States, for all that you do to support this timely topic of global relevance. We are grateful to our audience. Please join us at future events. Your support is critical to helping us continue our work, developing and supporting women leaders in international affairs. Stay connected. Join us as a member if you aren't already. Consider giving your time as a mentor in our mentoring program to help prepare and launch the next generation of women leaders in foreign policy. Thank you and good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Be safe.